All right, guys, I think that we will get going with this. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Sarah Bufkin, who is an assistant professor in political theory at Birmingham University. She was previously an examination fellow at Oxford, at All Souls, where she did her doctoral studies. Dr. Bufkin works on anti-imperial techniques of government, racism, racial capitalism, and draws on different traditions, ranging from the Black Atlantic radical thought tradition to the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies. I think that now she's going to present us a talk on Frantz Fanon and why political theories should look at kind of more sociologically grounded accounts of anti-racist critique. So I think that you want to hear from her.
Great. Thanks so much, y'all, for coming along. I know it's a beautiful day out, and the weather can be unpredictable on this island, so it means a lot that you're in a seminar room with me as opposed to outside. And thank you to Sebastian for inviting me to come speak about this work. I think the kind of central disclaimer I need to begin with is that I am a political theorist. So I'm very excited to be talking to folks who are in sociology, who do critical social theory at a much more granular level than a political philosophy department has ever imagined. And I think I'm going to learn a lot from y'all. But in particular, this project and a lot of my work is kind of framed around a very specific set of conversations and arguments within political theory. And so I thought I would just say a little bit about that so you know who I'm speaking to and what kind of intervention I'm trying to make before I get into the talk itself. So a lot of my work is really pushing against what we might call the social weightlessness of political theory and its kind of contemporary mode. So in particular, a lot of normative or analytic political philosophy is engaged in a kind of insular project of clarifying normative principles. So what does equality mean? How should we understand justice? What does the ideal just society look like? What are its basic institutions? And isn't all that interested in actual injustice, actual forms of domination, or the social explanations and diagnoses that help us to understand where those injustices come from and how they might be ameliorated. And I think this is a profound misstep in many respects, which is not to say that the normative political theory project doesn't have its strengths and contributions to make. So in that respect, I'm trying to bring political theory closer to the project of social critique. And in particular, that means for me making two moves, one of which some critical theorists make, which is trying to bring the sociological very much back into the question of politics and the political. So this necessarily involves expanding the object of analysis beyond kind of formal considerations that you see in liberal political theory, where the primary relation that is the problem is that between the individual citizen and the state. So this is a much more expansive account of power. It's one that looks at forms of social structuration, largely shaped by, but not fully determined by capitalism, by certain modes of state government of particular populations, so opposed to just thinking about the state as a problem of ideal type democracy. How do we think about how states wield power? And forms of social differentiation that work along lines that we commonly recognize today, such as gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, and class, although class works slightly differently. And then the second move I want to make, and one that is actually very controversial in certain forms of Frankfurt School critical theory today, is to bring the phenomenological or lived experience back into political theorizing. And I'm sure this is a debate that y'all are much more further along the track, so to speak, and having around why lived experience matters and how it might be embedded in forms of social theorizing critically rather than unreflexively, or in a kind of narrowly subjectivist way in which we take all experience as self-evident and unmediated truth, right? So that's not the direction I want to go, but I do think a lot of political theory has responded so much to these concerns that if people testify to harm, that harm necessarily exists, and therefore we can't trust anyone's testimony, so the hermeneutics of suspicion, by basically rejecting lived experience altogether. And I think that's not a very useful way of doing some forms of social critique, and I think Fanon's work shows us how we might be able to integrate lived experience back in more complex and sophisticated ways. Okay, but the commitment to the social and the commitment to lived experience may or may not be things that are new to you in the way they are to some of the political theorists I spend a lot of time talking to. So I'm really interested to hear where, for you, you find resources to do this work and where you think Fanon helps you or doesn't help you in terms of grounding a broader project of critique. Which brings me to this talk. which draws on a book that I'm currently writing on that is rereading Frantz Fanon and his method of anti-colonial and anti-racist critique for the post-imperial conjuncture. So I'm trying to take seriously the social and historical aspects of his analyses, rather than reading him as either a kind of narrow figure that focused on like psychological effects of colonialism, or as someone who reads him as offering an ontological account of race and racism. So I'm pushing back against folks who I think don't take his diagnoses seriously enough by only thinking of it as problems of mental health. But there's other folks who basically take his approach to thinking about racism and racialization and abstract it from history and from the material practices and processes that shape racial orders. And I think both directions kind of send us in unproductive ways. So what first drew me to Fanon, in particular, was a concern I had as a political theorist about what I would call the thinness of conceptions of race and racism that are operative within political theory today. And that's true both for normative political philosophy and for critical theory in the Frankfurt School variant. And I found in normative political theory, it's more expected because they're not that invested in doing sociological analysis themselves, that race was just kind of understood as prejudice, right? As a form of identity-driven prejudice, and there was no real kind of richness to the account of how race works and how it shapes embodied subjectivity. But in the Frankfurt School, it's very much a political project that's committed to working from actual injustice and modes of domination, oppression, and alienation. You know, it wants to critique the social formation at a systemic level with an eye towards emancipation. And so the fact that the Frankfurt School just doesn't really take race and racism very seriously, many of its contemporary thinkers at least, I thought was like a real gap and kind of epistemological blind spot in its own account of social theory. So a lot of political theory today then intends to approach racism, I found, in moralized terms. So as primarily a problem of bad actors who need to be retrained, right? So you can see this with a lot of the kind of anti-racist training that is an anti-prejudice training that's sort of, you know, circulated around various institutions. My university made all of our staff do anti-racist training, and while there's a space for that, I certainly don't think it's changed many of the broader structural and institutional problems we have with racial exclusion at the university to simply get all of our white colleagues in a room being like, here's things you shouldn't say to your students, right? It's a very limited approach. And then the other thin account of race that I find a lot is in a way of theorizing race that treats it as an epiphenomenal aspect of broader capitalist imperatives. So it tends to deny the ways in which practices of racialization and the discourses that legitimate those practices have built worlds structured in racial dominance. So race becomes simply a kind of strategy for capital to divide the working class, right? It doesn't have its own social effectivity in the world, and therefore can already be sort of moved to the side for the primary analysis of the critique of certain capitalisms. But ultimately, racisms, I think and argue, drawing in part on Fanon, outlast the moment of their functional utility for capital, even if they sort of first emerge and construct a broader regime of expropriation. And the afterlife of racial slavery and colonialism continues to structure social formations today in hierarchical and exclusionary ways, as well as to provide a kind of reservoir of deep stereotypes that are profoundly racialized and get re-articulated for new political projects. Race, in effect, has become a common sense way of understanding, interpreting, and navigating our worlds, regardless of whether or not it has any sort of biological or cultural facticity, which it obviously does not. And so this is what brought me to Fanon in the first place, was the sense that race itself was being under-theorized and sort of under-accounted for in contemporary political theory as well as forms of critical theory. And in particular, I thought Fanon offered a really helpful methodological exemplar for how we might approach the facticity of racial worlds and racialized subjects without being limited by them, by always having an eye towards a horizon in which an anti-racist world was possible, in which we could be fundamentally no longer fixed in place by a raciological vision of the world. And I find that vision very inspiring, and I thought that Fanon does a lot to move us beyond accounts where we don't take race and racism seriously enough as structuring phenomena, but also not allowing us to be limited to them. And with that, I will start. So this is the book project that this is drawing upon. So part of what makes Frankfurt School critical theory distinctive as a mode of critique is its commitment to the diagnosis of social pathologies. Social pathologies in this tradition are generally understood to be problems of societal dysfunction or misdevelopment that undermine individual flourishing or healthy forms of life, and which tend to reproduce themselves, just as illness tends to impair other aspects of a body's functioning. Yet for all that Axel Honneth described the disclosure of social pathologies to be central to the early Frankfurt School's approach to critique, some scholars have worried that this aspect of critical theory has lost its radical edge, first in Habermas and then in Honneth's work. Both thinkers Fabian Freienhagen and Neil Harris suggest have adopted an overly narrow account of social dysfunction and an overly optimistic view of the existing institutional apparatuses and normative orders that govern 21st century capitalism on a dying planet. They therefore suggest returning to earlier generations of the Frankfurt School or to French critical social theory, thinkers like Rousseau or Durkheim, to reinvigorate social pathology critique. In this talk, I contend that contemporary critical theory can instead find the resources for such a project by turning to Frantz Fanon. In particular, I argue that Fanon can be productively read as a diagnostician of the racialized pathologies produced by colonialism and white supremacy. Like Rousseau, Marcuse, and other key practitioners of this critical social theory tradition, Fanon used his analyses of existential dislocation to disclose and interrogate the social sources of individual and subjective suffering. In his view, the neuroses or psychological dysfunctions that manifested in colonial worlds were symptoms of the disordered nature of racial colonialism itself. They were indicative of the broader, and this is his quote, pathologies of freedom that colonial hierarchies produced. In turn, these alienated forms of subjectivity, these alienated forms of life transformed actional subjects into reactive subjects, foreclosing the possibilities of new political action that would challenge or contest the closures of colonial worlds. In this respect, the colonial world was, for Fanon, not merely a site and source of serious injustice, although it certainly was that, and I don't want to deny it, but that colonialism also created deeply disordered social formations, where systemic practices of racist dehumanization and depersonalizing violence fundamentally undermined the normative claim of Euromodern humanism and foreclosed the possibility of meaningful intersubjective recognition. Now, I put Fanon into conversation with this broader critical social theory tradition for three reasons. First, I think there are notable parallels and similarities between the two projects, even though Fanon was more influenced by French existentialism and the French reception of Hegel than he was by the German tradition of Hegelian Marxism. Like critical theorists from Adorno and Horkheimer to Marcuse, Fanon argues that critique must grapple with both the objective and subjective dimensions of pathological social relations if it is to provide a suitable diagnosis or to gesture towards emancipatory possibilities. His work, in turn, provides a valuable and urgent sociological corrective to the Frankfurt School, where colonialism and racism have largely received marginal treatment, if they are mentioned at all. Second, I think that the socio-diagnostic approach to Fanon's work aligns with a more expansive reading of his own writings. It brings his psychiatric work, his social theory, and his political analysis together into a cogent and coherent project. For Fanon wasn't merely indicting and condemning the wrongs of colonial dominion, although he certainly did do that with vehemence and moral clarity, but I argue he was interested in the longue durée of colonial worlds and colonized selves, and the dialectical ways in which the dysfunctions of the former were interiorized in the latter, and the practices of the latter, of colonized selves, reproduced the former, colonized worlds, through logics of disempowerment or disavowal. And third, Fanon's objects of critique remain not only relevant, but increasingly urgent today. In a post-colonial Europe where white ethno-nationalisms are motivating new authoritarian popular formations, and the organized neglect of racialized populations in the wake of neoliberal capitalism, increasingly militarized policing and bordering practices, and climate catastrophe continues to shape profoundly disordered worlds for anyone racialized as Black or brown. So this talk is going to proceed in 4 parts. So first, I look at social pathology critique within the critical theory tradition, its distinctive strengths, and the problems that it introduces for social theorists and political theorists. Second, I turn to Fanon to reconstruct his analyses of the racial neuroses that he argued individuals could develop in colonial orders. Third, I show how these psychopathologies can be read instead as diagnoses of broader social pathologies that are produced by colonialism and white supremacy. And this, in particular, I argue, adopts a particular reading of Fanon's work, one that foregrounds his social and historical analyses of racialization. And then finally, I'll briefly gesture towards what a Fanonian sociodiagnostics might help us to better grasp in the contemporary conjuncture. Several contemporary critical theorists have argued that what makes Frankfurt School critical theory and its practice of eminent critique distinctive is that its practitioners are engaged in the practice of diagnosing social pathologies. Rather than focusing more narrowly on individual moral wrongs or the illegitimate exercise of political authority, critical theorists seek to understand how forms of social life can become distorted, dysfunctional, maladjusted, or otherwise pathological. Now, at first glance, it may not make much sense to describe a society or a social formation as the kind of entity that can become ill, at least in the same way as one might describe an organism as sick. Durkheim famously attempted to read the social as structurally analogous to a complex organism, whose internal organs have distinctive functions, but work together in a harmonious whole to reproduce life. For him, one could describe a society as pathological when its institutions, norms, or laws fail to fulfill their function within the greater social whole. And for example, this is where his famous critique of anomie in 19th century Europe, he focuses on how industrialization and urbanization have loosened existing moral norms in ways that lead to sort of an overinflation of the market sphere and an underinflation of forms of normative social integration. Which he then thinks of anomie as a symptom of this broader kind of set of pathological developments or misdevelopments. So today, most critical social theorists are less wedded to the notion that society is like an organism, but they retain the thick ethical concept of a social pathology to critique instead how a society in its basic structure is deformed or unbalanced, or how its essential functions are disrupted, impaired, or misaligned, as Frederick Neuhauser puts it. In this respect, there's also often something self-reinforcing about social pathologies. The dysfunctional dynamics have a tendency not only to reproduce themselves, but to intensify. A pathological society degenerates. Its problems become more entrenched and harder to dislodge. For example, the pathological investments in fossil fuel extraction continue to build up the systemic demand for increased production, even as it feeds a decades-long carbon pipeline that is already disrupting the planetary climate and poses an existential threat to many non-human animals and human societies. Yet embracing social pathology as a thick ethical concept does pose political risks, given the ways in which the term has been historically used and abused to denigrate oppressed communities and to marginalize subaltern or transgressive forms of life. One need only think here of conservative attempts to blame the pathological breakdown of Black families for ongoing racial inequality, the Moynihan Report being the most kind of famous example of this in the US, or to remember the medicalized condemnation of homosexuality as deviant and gender dysmorphia as a disorder, to realize how easily the rhetorical force of abnormality and pathology can be turned to suspect and politically repressive ends. So there is a legitimate worry about adopting the language of pathology. The theorists can end up blaming the oppressed for their own oppression, rather than the social and political conditions which have created that disordered social relation in the first place. This slippage, however, can be minimized, I think, if social theorists retain their firm grasp on the social as the first-order site and source of the pathology or misdevelopment. As Fanon reminds us, if there is a flaw, it lies not in the soul of the individual, but in his environment. For thinkers like Neuhauser, Neil Harris, and Fabian Freienhagen, a renewed attention to social pathologies is worth the risk. This is because the method of critique offers two distinctive advantages for political theorists grappling with racial hierarchies. Well, the racial hierarchies part is my addition. They are concerned with other problems. So the first advantage is that it offers a broader ethical toolkit than the one usually deployed in normative political theory, which tends to focus more narrowly on questions of justice and political legitimacy. Many of the pathological conditions that critical theorists have analyzed, from the alienation of the worker under commodity capitalism to the pathological normalcy produced by the mass culture industry, would be mischaracterized or underdescribed, as Neuhauser puts it, as problems of justice, especially as problems of justice as fairness. And I'd suggest the same is true of racism and white supremacy as a form of disordered life. And second, the second advantage is that the social critic as diagnostician seeks not only to identify harms, but to trace them back to their root causes or source. This moves critical theory beyond an emphasis on moral prescription, i.e. the outlining of principles or laws that people or states ought to follow, and instead towards a more political engagement with what can be done to prevent or remove the social dysfunction in the first place. Methodologically speaking, then, Christopher Zurn argues that identifying social pathologies tends to involve 4 distinctive steps: a symptomology that identifies the relevant signs of societal dysfunction, an epidemiology that indexes them to particular social groups or populations, an etiology that links those symptoms back to their root causes in societies, and a prognosis directed at resolving these deficiencies and returning a social formation to flourishing. And as I'll now attempt to sketch briefly, I think that you can find in Fanon's anti-racist and anti-colonial critique a symptomology, an epidemiology, an etiology, and a prognosis for a disalienated world in the wake of colonialism. The disordered symptoms that Fanon identified across his oeuvre are numerous and well-known. The colonized subject whose, and this is a quote, psyche shrinks back, obliterates itself, and finds outlets in muscular releases of energy. The Creole woman who dreams of approximating whiteness through partnering with a white man. The black Martinican man who works hard to perfect the Frenchman's French and to lose his island accent. The French doctors who thingify their patients in Algeria by calling them al-Muhammad. The French policeman who beats his wife and children after coming home from torturing Algerians. The French settler who dreams of a group of Algerian women suggestive of the harem. The latter was another direct quote. Whereas some observers might treat these psychic experiences of distress as little more than individual neuroses, Fanon refuses to lose sight of their social causes. As he writes about the colonized, if at a certain point in his history he has been made to ask the question whether he is a man, it is because his reality as a man has been challenged. Fanon's phenomenological analyses of racism and colonial subjection are both descriptive and diagnostic. Etiologically speaking, most of his writings focus on the lived experience of the racially oppressed and the colonized. But he also suggests that the Manichaean dream of white superiority, too, can produce distorted forms of self-relation in the colonizer, or the white dominant subject. As he puts it, the white subject, too, can become locked in his whiteness, much as the black subject can become locked in his blackness. Crucially for Fanon, not all individuals racialized as black or white would experience these forms of dislocation and psychic dysfunction. So contra Sartre and psychoanalysts like Lacan, he rejected the idea that the moment of alienation was a necessary or foundational condition of all individuals within the social. Instead, he argued there was such a thing as normal or undistorted subjective formation. As Fanon saw it, sociality was not just a source of repression or alienation, but also provided the necessary conditions for successful individual self-realization. The task for the psychopathologist and for the critical theorist, then, involves separating out the ethical and humane forms of social integration from those which dehumanize, disempower, and distort individual possibilities for flourishing. How, then, does Fanon diagnose these disordered forms of racialized subjectivity? To which social roots does he trace back his catalog of individual symptoms? I argue he explains these psychopathologies by linking them to their experiential basis in oppressive social formations. Regular exposure to practices of racist dehumanization, he argues, can change how individual subjects relate to themselves, their desires, and their habits. This is where the alienation critique becomes pivotal for Fanon. Unlike Marx, who saw alienation in terms of an individual's separation from their labor, Fanon argues that white supremacy and colonial dominion can separate racialized individuals from a right relation to their being in the world and to their own agency. Or as Paul Gilroy puts it, Fanon used the idea to index the estrangement from authentic human being in the body and being in the world that colonial social relations had wrought. Here, Fanon draws on conceptual resources from French existential phenomenology, especially from Sartre, Kojève, and Merleau-Ponty, as well as from a psychological training, including on psychoanalysts like Freud and Lacan. Fanon begins by appropriating the reification critique from the existentialists to theorize the intersubjective injury that racisms inflict on colonized subjects, the phenomenology of being misrecognized for an inferior, otherwise stereotypically devalued other, for being treated as if we're an animal or an object. Under Fanon's paradigm, anti-Black racism reifies the Black subject into little more than an always already known inferior type, whose possibilities of subjectivity are denied and silenced. This is a presence as erasure, the hypervisibility of the Black body as the invisibility of Black subjectivity. Racism makes even the straightforward tasks of living, from shopping at the store to applying for a bank loan to speaking with a colleague to driving down the street, into difficult and potentially dangerous outings. Constantly navigating projections of Black inferiority, then, displaces Black subjects from their own corporeal existence. Or as the American poet Claudia Rankine writes, the worst injury is feeling you do not belong so much to you. Fanon argues that when persistent and routine, conditions of racialized misrecognition can be interiorized. They effectively distort individual subject formation in ways that displace them from a healthy relationship to their embodied selves and hinders their capacity for creative self-realization. Racist imaginaries can be taken into the body, shaping its habitus and its reflexes, its anxieties and its desires. Fanon explores these processes of interiorization most directly in psychoanalytic terms, arguing that an exposure to white supremacy can produce problematic or unhealthy coping strategies in the Black or colonized subjects whose selves are regularly dehumanized. As he put it in a 1956 lecture, we must ask, what are their defense mechanisms? One of the primary pathological symptoms that Fanon diagnosed in Black Martinican subjects, for example, was the tendency to develop an all-consuming desire for equal recognition from the white French colonizer, an affective investment that he argued was both doomed to fail on structural grounds and which can produce alienated self-relations. For example, some Black and Creole Martinicans that he analyzed attempted to whiten or, as he put it, lactify themselves by adopting white forms of life. Such desires for Fanon were disordered. They were a sign that the Black subject had accepted the inferiorized picture of Blackness that the white world has produced. For Fanon, then, the desire for white recognition is first and foremost to be critically interrogated, not celebrated. Or as his narrator in Chapter 5 of Black Skin, White Mass put it, all this whiteness burns me to a crisp. By contrast, he argued that many white subjects were likely to be both mystifiers and mystified. They had participated in and benefited from these racial hierarchies while actively working to deny and disavow the very injustices such hierarchies produced. In colonial orders, for example, white individuals worked hard to legitimate and naturalize their projects of expropriation, dispossession, and violence by putting forward theories of essential racial difference. Such theories operated both at the level of scientific knowledge about human types. Natural historians, anatomic scientists, and ethnopsychiatrists fiercely debated the epistemic grounds for racial distinction in the 18th and 19th centuries, and some geneticists today have returned to searching for the biological determinant for race at the level of the genome. But also these racialized narratives and imaginaries took root at the level of the popular common sense. As Fanon puts it, the French imperial metropole constructed an idea of the Black man out of, and this is a quote, out of 1,000 details, anecdotes, and stories, cannibalism, backwardness, fetishism, racial stigmas, slave traders, and above all, the grinning Ia Bon Banania, which is a reference to a racist advert, I think, for chocolate milk in France. White subjects imaginatively projected that which was unwanted, repulsive, abject in themselves onto the idea of the racial other, whose presumed inferiority legitimated their subjection to white rule. As Fanon notes, borrowing from Sartre's critique of anti-Semitism, what is called the Black soul is a construction by white folk. These historical racial schemas, however, say more about white knowers, their fears and anxieties, their ignorance and their empathetic failures than they do about Black or Arab people. Such a racialized imaginary, in turn, orients white subjects' own sense of self, gives them the security of being white, and therefore superior, civilized, rational, manly, entitled to the abundance of the natural world and the fruits of one's own labor, and often, too, to the labor of others. Claiming whiteness in racial hierarchies is a way of locating oneself within the grids of social intelligibility and the status hierarchies they regulate. By taking up the position of the white subject, individuals benefited both from the forms of material advantage that capitalist formations structured in racial dominance afford them, and from the psychic wage, to borrow from Du Bois, of belonging to the superior in-group. There are pleasures to be found in white dominion, even when one is a subordinate partner. Now, while critical whiteness studies has generally preferred to look to US thinkers like Du Bois and James Baldwin to understand both the wages of whiteness and the ethical monstrosity that becoming white presents, Fanon's grounding in both psychoanalysis and existential phenomenology helps him to map the ambivalences, tensions, and libidinal drives that shape the neurotic orientations that many subjects racialized as white develop. Investments in white superiority may bring both material and psychic benefits, but they are also existentially unstable, Fanon argued. They require adopting postures of denial and disavowal, of cultivating forms of active ignorance or forgetting about the violences committed in one's name. What characterizes the white subject's existential condition in racial orders, then, is the cultivated contradiction between their practices and their consciousness. Or, as Baldwin stressed, many white people do not want to know about the extent of Black suffering, both because that would place them in a morally compromising position and because anti-Black racism has conditioned them to simply not care as much about what happens to Black people. Fanon describes this existential affective incapacity to value Black life in Black skin white masks as affective ankylosis, referring to a medical condition that fuses the spine in place and prevents the body from flexible and regular movement. Alienated white subjects, for Fanon, have ossified. They have lost their analytical flexibility, their ability to bend towards and react to others. As Kelly Oliver argues, subjectivity and humanity are the result of response ability. That which precludes a response destroys subjectivity and thereby humanity. In racial hierarchies, then, many white subjects cannot stand in a responsive and responsible relation to their own individual agency and to the people whose equal humanity they deny. Or as Fanon puts it, unable to confront all these demands, the white man shirks his responsibility. I have a phrase for this, the racial allocation of guilt. And this is clearly where the normative aspect of Fanon's diagnosis becomes unavoidable, against the backdrop of rampant police killings, regular torture, the massacre of native towns, the systematic dispossession, robbery of Black and Native communities, a war on Gaza. There can be no room for white ignorance or apathy. Fanon's diagnosis of the disordered and dysfunctional forms of embodied self-relation available within colonial worlds, however, is not without its critics. Scholars like Cedric Robinson have rejected his reflections in Black skin, white masks as little more than a colonial bourgeois preoccupation. In Robinson's view, then, this narrow psychological focus on Black people's subjective responses to white supremacy deflects attention away from the structures, institutions, and systemic imperatives of capital that actually produce racisms and their violences. And there's something to Robinson's argument. I think a narrowly psychological account of racisms and their harms doesn't get us where we need to go. But I contend that Robinson adopts an uncharitable reading of Fanon, one that disconnects his reckoning with the lived experience of racial dominion from his broader project of social and anti-colonial critique. I contend that Fanon's critique was not meant to only describe the specific psychological traumas suffered by the racially oppressed, but instead to use these phenomenological profiles to indict and diagnose the broader social pathologies produced by colonialism and white supremacy. When individuals are controlled by obsessions, paranoia, anxieties, or compulsions that prevent them from determining their own way in the world, Fanon argued, then psychologists rightly describe these people as unfree. When those self-undermining attitudes have social rather than neurological causes, he argued, they become a problem for political theorists too, as pathologies of freedom. As he puts it, two equally powerful, equally determinate aspects might be able to help with the diagnostic, the ego aspect and the social aspect. But to move from the problem of psychopathology to social pathology will take a distinctive method, what Fanon himself called a sociogenic approach to the critique of racisms and racialization. In Black Skin, White Mass, Fanon defines his sociogenic method in contradistinction to either studying human beings as a species with certain essential traits or predispositions, or to the abstract individual in its development through its sort of psychological developmental model that we get from Freud. Neither approach for Fanon captured the existential obstacles that the black individual faces under white supremacy or that the colonized subject faces under European imperialism. As Fanon puts it, ontology does not allow us to understand the being of the black man since it ignores the lived experience. It ignores the special character of the colonial situation. This is why Fanon argued that race could only be understood by returning it to the social. Racism should be analyzed within the specific conjunctures in which they emerge and function. In this respect, I foreground the social and historical aspects of Fanon's analysis rather than using his existentialist writings to make either world historical or quasi-ontological claims about the nature of the other or about the anti-black conditions of Euromodernity as a kind of epoch. I contend that Fanonian sociogenesis as a method makes two critical moves. First, it engages in a critical unmasking of racialized world-making. From the objective vantage point, Fanon unpacks how different racial formations take shape and appear to the people within them as incontestable, as the inert order of things. In his analyses of the distinctive racial worlds built in French Martinique and French Algeria and back home in the French imperial metropole, Fanon maps the mechanisms that made race into a meaningful partition of the social in each context, racializing practices and discourses, institutions and architectures, imaginaries and affects. For example, Fanon's critiques of raciological reason take aim at both the production of elite knowledges about the black or Arab other, whether through ethnopsychiatry or colonial anthropology, but also at the sedimentation of racial stereotypes, images, fantasies, affects, and narratives that cohere at the level of the social unconscious. In turn, his study of the colonial world foregrounds the specific political technologies developed to dominate, brutalize, and manage colonized populations, from the rigid control of mobility to the routine and spectacular use of violence. While Euro-modern states govern their populations through the manufactured consent of civil society primarily, Fanon points out that the colonial government instead functions through brute force. In the colonies, it is the policeman and the soldier who are the official instituted go-betweens, the spokesman of the settler and his role of oppression. In this respect, one can read his theorization of the distinctive spatiality of colonial power, the racialized strategies of imperial government, and the complex arrangements of resource capture and financial dependency that structured the colonial economy as in keeping with his earlier injunction that it's colonization itself that needs to be put on trial. By returning this Manichaean world back to the social conditions of its making, Fanon denaturalizes the racial categories that world seeks to render static. He reminds us that a given racial formation is the product of contingent relations of force, and that these hierarchical orders could be dismantled or transformed, depending on the political coalitions brought into play. The second part of the sociogenic method of critique, in turn, involves the use of existential phenomenology and psychiatry to interrogate the practices of individual subject formation under racial colonialism. Adopting this subjective first-person vantage is vital, Fanon argued, to understand how racialized subjects experience their embodied racial selves. Within racist cultures, Fanon points out, racialized logics of identity and status function as key existential parameters or horizons that individuals must navigate, whose salience is driven by complex visual technologies of racialization, political hierarchies of status, imagined communities of belonging, and differential proximity to social and economic capital. So I contend that Fanon understands racialized identity not as a question of metaphysics, but as an existential phenomenon that is tied, as Stuart Hall puts it, to the taking up of a specific subject position within a racial order. It was important to understand and engage with this phenomenological perspective in turn because it was only from such a vantage point that a social critic could access and diagnose the ways that colonial violence and racist dehumanization can alienate and metamorphose the individuals subjected to those practices. As Fanon puts it, the problem of colonization, therefore, comprises not only the intersection of historical and objective conditions, but also man's attitude towards those conditions. Yet crucially, Fanon always linked these subjective neuroses or forms of dysfunction back up to the situational complex of both impersonal forces, structures, discourses, modes of governance, and interpersonal relations that produce them. Fanonian sociogenesis then moves dialectically between these two perspectives. It looks for answers on the objective as well as the subjective level. Read together then, I argue that Fanon's existential phenomenology and his materialism, and I mean materialism in terms of more like a pragmatism, so a concern with the material practices that co-constitute subject and world, enable him to critique the real conditions of racial subject formation without falling back into a misleading racial essentialism that mistakes contingent, political, and unstable differences for a primordial and authoritarian capital D difference. For all that he acknowledged the shared subjective experiences of racism, Fanon was aware of how different objective conditions, from class to nationality to gender, impacted the ways in which racisms functioned and the kinds of subject positions that were made available. And he made it clear that different forms of racialization, from the Arab man in French Algeria to the Creole woman in French Martinique, needed to be understood in their specific relations. Adopting a sociogenic approach to the study of racism and racialization, of course, does invite a new methodological problem, namely that Fanon was writing at a very different conjunctural moment than the one we navigate today. He wrote out of the heart of anti-colonial struggle and in the twilight of Europe's formal empires in Africa and Asia. The Manichaean delirium that he did so much to theorize and indict has since been recomposed and remade by shifting economic, political, and social relations, not least of which has been the formal moment of political decolonization across the global south. Political theorists, therefore, must be careful when it comes to transplanting Fanon's ideas from the specific anti-colonial context in which he worked and struggled to other geographies and racial formations. Racisms take on different ideological forms and carry out different kinds of political work across historical contexts. As Stuart Hall noted, racism is always historically specific. Though it may draw on the cultural traces deposited by previous historical phases, it always takes specific forms. It arises out of present, not past, conditions. Yet I want to suggest that Fanon's method can A, be used as an exemplar for anti-racist critique in racial orders far removed from his own lived experience and political concerns, and B, that for all that the formal decolonization of the world has accelerated since Fanon's death, many of the pathologies that he diagnosed in the colonial worlds of settler Algeria and mid-century Martinique remain with us, even if articulated in new forms. Neo-imperial modes of government that still mobilize racialized logics of population management, discipline, and neglect, a global capitalist regime structured in racial dominance that continues to extract value, exploit labor, and dispossess land through post-colonial relations of debt and dependency, and racial imaginaries that continue to figure black and brown others as dangerous, deviant, and disposable, while churning up old white settler anxieties about demographic threat and racial decline. Now, at first glance, Fanon's critique of black alienation, particularly when indexed to the pathological investments that black subjects can develop in whiteness and white superiority, does not seem to have as much purchase on post-colonial contexts. In the decades since Fanon's first worried about colonialism and the drive to lactify or otherwise mimic the colonizer's culture and values, the symbolic topography has shifted on its axis. Blackness is no longer a sign of pure negation, but instead has been reclaimed by black social movements as a sign of positive identification and resistance. And yet, at the same time, colorism is not a problem of the past. Many members of racialized minorities continue to feel the weight of whiteness in a country in which more than 80% of the population is racialized as white, speaking about the UK here. Rather than indict the sort of alienated desires to become white that Fanon criticized in Black Skin, White Masks, however, it might be more productive instead to consider the toll that routine exposure to racist discrimination, dehumanization, and violence, both physical and symbolic, takes on Black, Muslim, and other racially minoritized people in the UK today. Recent research indicates that the persistent and routine exposure to racism is often taken into the body, that the stress raises blood pressure, increases mental health concerns, causes complications in pregnancy, shortens life expectancies, etc. Racisms, as Shatima Threadcraft points out, can still kill fast and slow. I would argue, however, that Fanon's critique of racism as a kind of social pathology perhaps has more to say about the politics of white ethno-nationalism, which is driving resurgent authoritarian populisms in fortress Europe and white settler states like the US. So the critique of whiteness might have more to say than the critique of black alienation today, but I'd be interested in chatting with you folks about that. In today's UK, for example, this Fanonian approach helps to grasp how so many white and white-identified English subjects continue to explain and experience the material losses inflicted by the neoliberalization of the British economy, the financialization of the housing market, stagnant wages, austerity cuts to state spending, and crumbling forms of public infrastructure through forms of ethno-nationalist common sense that blame migrants who threaten British values, jobs, and resources. Today's images and ideas of the migrant and the asylum seeker are often not framed as explicitly on anti-Black grounds as the Border Control Acts passed in the 1960s and 70s to limit non-white immigration to the UK. And yet they continue to play off racialized ideas of civilizational difference, which posits a fundamental and immutable clash between white Judeo-Christian culture and Islam. And this is, the quote from Nigel Farage that I feel like many people have to put up. I'm not going to read it out, but I think it's indicative of the ways in which so much of this discourse and rhetoric is symbolically structured. The object of racism is no longer the individual man, but a certain form of existing. Fanon notes, Little England is once more under threat, but this time from both racialized asylum seekers on the boats and from low-status populations in Central and Eastern Europe who were only recently and precariously racialized as white. This re-emergent racism of fear, however, has also been supplemented by a racism of contempt, one which finds consolation in the presumed superiority of Englishness, understood as a blood inheritance that marks out those who belong from those who intrude. Fanon's work on the psychic and affective investments in white superiority, too, tells us something important about the pleasures to be had, the succor to be taken from forms of white dominion, even among those members of the white working and lower middle classes who no longer reap the material benefits of Britain's post-war economic settlement. In fact, such feelings of racial and national superiority might become even more tightly held and actively mobilized in communities whose previous mechanisms of securing recognition and self-esteem, such as steady employment, affordable housing, debt-fueled conspicuous consumption, for example, are no longer guaranteed. Or to borrow again from Paul Gilroy, one could say that these nativist attachments reflect the increasing fears of those who feel themselves to be superior, but find that the contemporary world withholds automatic assent to their historical demand for power and recognition. And there is pleasure to be taken in righteous indignation, in the politics of perceived grievance. These affects should not be taken lightly. As conservative media outlets and social media platform companies have already found, outraged discourse provokes much more audience engagement than dispassionate analysis. And crucially, I think it's important to note that this white nativist politics, too, is obviously both classed and gendered, with performative rituals of masculine aggression stepping in to replace the perceived material and symbolic threats to traditional forms of male status, not least of which is the moral panic over grooming gangs, ostensibly led by Muslim men, especially those of Pakistani origin. But perhaps most worryingly, these racialized and nationalist feelings of entitlement and resentment stand in the way of a deeper reckoning with the overdetermined crises of economic productivity, state capture, environmental catastrophe, and social anomie that have taken shape in the wake of neoliberal austerity and its depoliticizing ethos of individual consumption. As Fanon reminds us, one of the most pathological effects of the colonial world's Manichaean delirium is the politics that it forecloses. Racisms mystify more than they reveal. They substitute easy answers and affects for the difficult, taxing, and uncomfortable work of contesting extractive regimes of accumulation or the hierarchical modes of citizenship that regulate which populations are needed for production and which can be made surplus. In this respect, a Fanonian diagnosis might see the ascendancy of white authoritarian populisms today as a pathological coping mechanism, a disordered response to a series of overlapping crises that the ready solidarity of racial belonging responds to, and yet to which it offers no real answers. In a time in which far-right groups and rhetoric have moved into the UK's political mainstream, it becomes increasingly vital that political theorists grapple with racism and racialization not merely as a problem for moral critique, that being racist is wrong, but as a problem for social critique. What political work is it that racisms continue to do? Fanon, I think, shows us a clear path forward. Thank you.